get going. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Heffron Software Platform project and the evolution that that basically had like over the past few months, and how we basically see the project moving forward, and how we're going to be like connecting with the other segment groups and teams in Linaro. And of course, like for those that doesn't actually know myself, I'm Ricardo Salvetti. Rejoined Linaro like 6 months ago, like the previous Connect, and been working in Linaro like the last time that I was involved with Linaro was leading the developer platform project in like 2011, 12 or something along the line. And since then, been leading the Heffron Software Platform project together with Emmett, Yang, and now Robert, who's involved with the technical writing. So that's pretty much what I've been doing since I got back. So what I'm going to be covering now is basically give an update, general update, like since the previous Connect, what kind of things that we did, what we delivered, and covering the past releases. We had like 3 releases officially. The 2 are kind of the main ones, which is like 15.12 and 16.03, which we just released this Saturday before Connect. And as I said, talk a little bit about the following steps and how we see the project moving forward, and of course, like giving up some answer questions as well. So here, basically on Connect, on SFO 15. The project, the Heffron Software Platform lead project, was announced and presented to the TSC members. And George gave a nice presentation, I think it was on Monday, which was covering Yang, who couldn't be there. And the project itself was announced with the goals and reviewed by TSC later on, and approved officially in October. Since then, we're running as a lead project effort in Linaro. And kind of we started with the goals is have basically open source software, which is, as we say, like the Heffron software for the 96 boards products that we had at that time, which was like HighKey and Dragonboard. And also, of course, allowing and including Linaro members hardware and possibly other community hardware when, depending, of course, on the level of engagement and from the community. And the idea was basically to try to kind of help reducing the engineering effort for people to build products or solutions on top of the projects that we're developing in Linaro. And instead of like letting each vendor, each consumer replicating that internally, instead like let's try to focus on one single kind of platform, treat it as a reference. And so we can reduce the engineering effort from everyone. And also provide end-to-end use cases, which is what like George was like was saying like earlier today, is having a complete use case, since like from on a case like a HighKey or Dragonboard, you're managing like the DPIOs, and you want to have like one application that is shared between the 96 boards until you go to the cloud, including the boot architecture, kernel, the distros, and enterprise, and all the cool stuff. But of course, like this idea is not new. We tried to build like what kind of similar approaches before in Linaro, and we always had like that idea of like like become a distribution or not, what kind of things that are going to be maintaining and so on. And we wanted to start this project with a strong message that the upstreaming is actually the end goal. And what we wanted to do is like, until of course the development is fully upstream, is to offer a kind of a platform for everybody to work together and reduce the duplication and improve the development as well, including validation and through the releases. And also including the documentation covering not only how to install the builds, but also how to consume, explaining the builds, how to build from source, because as being a reference for like producing a Heffron image, we also want everyone to not be only using that, but of course like producing from scratch, which is mostly useful for people rebuilding that into products. And so this was the initial workflow as presented. Basically, we had many different teams in Linaro, mostly the segment groups. And they all had components that they were responsible for. And what we wanted to try to do is like work together with them as they deliver, or like through the flow of delivering that in upstream, for example. Work together with them to help creating either like trees or maintaining those deliverables in a common place where everybody could consume and use and enjoy the effort as well. Which is why, like in the end, everything that we do ends up like being published as part of the Heifer's platform builds and hosted on the 96 Boards website. So it's a cross-team effort across the multiple segment groups and teams, and seeing, of course, like what are the kind of the priorities for each of the teams, and try to work together to simplify and produce builds that would consume those things and deliver, of course, like for people that want to use. The initial milestones as proposed was basically right after Connect. There was the idea of having the 1510, as we call it, the preview or alpha release, was basically kind of to bootstrap the project and see and have a kind of a better understanding of the issues that we had at that time. And looking forward for what we call the feature releases, but it's still like as a preview at this stage, which was the 1512 and the 1603, which we just released. And the deliverables itself, they are composed by builds and images, binary images, for example, in the case of the high key and a Dragon board, which we just like want to get along and download the image and flash the image and use that. But also, of course, having the source code available, or even if you're using, for example, an upstream tree, but pointing out to that tree and explaining how we're building that and how we incorporate that component as part of the binary build. And including, of course, like the release process, the documentation, the QA, something that we're also doing like for all of those like proposed milestones, not simply just getting the builds in place and the binaries in place, for example, and having without like proper validation. We want to make sure that on every release that we do, for every work that we do, it's properly validated, and we do have like a CI running with a lot of work for QA. During the release process, and then of course like having the complete set of documentation from like producing the image, for using the image, the QA reports, and everything that it would be interesting from someone wanted to understand, use, and produce and reproduce what we did. So covering a little bit on what we delivered and kind of showing the flow of the things that we learned through the process as well. As I said in the beginning, simply for the first milestone, the major idea was let's bootstrap the project. Let's understand better what is kind of the problems that we had. In particular, like at that stage, we had like multiple images for the different boards, in the case like the high key and the Dragon board. Each one following like a different release schedule with different requirements. And each one with different kernel, like different bootloader, different versions of it, and so on. So what we really wanted to do at that stage is like get together with everyone that was maintaining that, kind of understanding what are the gaps, how can we get like both, like a little bit closer, and start like filling up some of the gaps in there. And through the process, understand what are the upstreaming status, for example, for the bootloader and kernel. And start like helping as well, like planning on how we can improve that, and in order like as the end goal is always make sure that everything is upstream properly. So we also, of course, like had the idea that the images that we're going to be producing would be which was already happening before we actually got to do this milestone, was the AOSP build for high key. But in this case, like the goal was to produce like using the Marshmallow release. The Debian reference platform builds for both high key and Dragon board, kind of looking on unifying a little bit the changes and the features that were like part of both images before. And we didn't want to set up kind of a challenge in the beginning, like could it actually be possible to have like one single kernel, in that case like the 403 for both the Dragon board and high key? How hard would that be? And at that moment, I think the high key kernel was like 318 based, and the Qualcomm Linux team was working on a 402 or already working on the 403. So we wanted to start, like, since they were already maintaining the 403 kernel, we wanted to start like engaging with them and seeing and understanding better the problems, and trying to bring up like the high key support as well. So here's what we were able to deliver in the end. We set up the project wiki, which relies on GitHub. So if you go like GitHub /96 boards, you got the documentation project, and there you have like the wiki page describing the builds, describing what we delivered, and how to use and reproduce and rebuild from scratch as well. The CI jobs, we got everything like automated. We had like a great CI infrastructure already in place with Jenkins and being able to have like containers in every kind of architecture and every kind of distribution. So it made like super easy for us to simply get along and produce those and create those CI jobs. It was like completely smooth, which was great, great experience. And we also had a single kernel repository for both boards in that case, based on 403, but unfortunately we were not actually able to have one single tree, one single branch for both of them, because we found out actually that there were like several conflicts on ADV 7511 driver. And we knew that at that time we had like conversations going upstream, but we had like several hacks or changes that were like specific to one board, for example, that would kind of end up like breaking the other one. So we decided to kind of postpone the idea to have one single branch and start like having a kind of a better understanding first, and talk with the upstream maintainers and also like the development from both teams to make sure that that we could fix that issue in particular. This is interesting because I think it is one of the not only both boards like end up like sharing the same hardware and the driver, but since we also wanted to use the same version, we needed to get both, you know, like kind of along together. And we found out like that those kind of issues could end up like having, you know, like being common later on. So we really wanted to see like what are kind of the complications that I had at that time. And what we were able to deliver in the end, we did the Debian build. We did a few changes, mostly on adding a few other missing applications, kind of getting a common, just like kind of a theme or like a kind of a look and feel that looks kind of, you know, like the same. Not like actually producing a lot of packages or changes and so on, but simply trying to get kind of the experience to be similar with each other. And we could make we were not actually able to make one single rootfs. This is something that I was looking for in the beginning. But we did like have the build job for it, simply because there were like firmware limitations, the license limitations. And if you include the Mali, for example, you need a click-through, and then on the Dragon board, there's like several kind of limitations in EULA as well. If you're distributing the firmware, it needs to be part of the package, only for that board in particular. So we decided to not getting that fight at that point. And so we had the same build job, but in the end of the day, it was like two different root file systems. For high key, for the AOSP build, we still kind of were relying on the 318, but we were able actually to update to the latest AOSP release at that time. It was great work by Vishal and then the mobile working group and the lending team as well. Which this was kind of the starting point, not actually the starting point, of course, like, but it was like one of the very like basic milestones, important milestones, to basically be able to do that announcement that George did today, which is now like fully supported by upstream without any extra change. So then, of course, the lessons learned through the process. We had like too many kernel trees available all around. Like each one developer, like a distribution, or you know, like even the team inside Linaro had their own like kernel, mostly because there wasn't a kind of a good understanding of what was lacking in upstream. Like nobody actually knew for sure if the board would boot or not. Like it was kind of a common question we had, like an RC in the channel, like can I just like get Debian and boot it? You know, like the latest kernel? No, you can't. Like depending on the board, like you have like this kind of, you know, like support or not. So we try to, like, reducing that amount of duplication would be like, like a critical piece of the work. So we could like focus on one single thing, which is like having the reference tree available, which would be shared. But in the end of the day, trying to, like, having a better understanding how we can like push further for upstream. We didn't actually understand a lot on the upstreaming, like what was actually missing. Like the lending team had, of course, like an overview, each of the lending teams, what are the pieces that are working on and so on, but it wasn't clear for anyone else. So it was like a common question that we had all the time. And as I said, like for the single root file system, we had like firmware issues, licensing issues, and something that we still need to try to go through later on, which we're already doing, like especially for the Mali driver. And in order to reduce, of course, like the maintenance and on the Linaro overlay, not becoming a distribution and not creating too many packages or like updating them, we needed to start like working closer with backports, which was then when we decided to basically include that backports by default, and trying to get some of the changes through Debian, of course, like because then we first make sure that it's in Debian, it's in upstream, so later on we're going to have like less work, but also we can simply just enable backport for the packages. Then moving on to the next release, which was like super like an intense cross-team kind of effort, because like with the 15.10 release, we did have the initial builds and the project was started, but mostly focused on the consumer edition at that time. For 15.12, we wanted to like do the same thing but for enterprise, especially because at that time and like we were like waiting for Husky, like was always like coming, and like at the end of the day, it's still to come. But we decided to still like bootstrap the project, make sure that we could, like use instead of Husky, for example, use the other member hardware that we had that were not necessarily used even in Linaro, like the 302 and Overdrive, which were great platforms and were like kind of somehow like easily available internally. And as part of the enterprise goal, enterprise is a little bit different, right? You always need, of course, like since you've been like many people talking about this, like in the previous Connect, like you need standards and you need to follow the standards, and there's no other way, basically. Either you follow the standard or you're out. So we didn't want to have one single, at least like one implementation, one like firmware implementation using Tyon Core 80K2, and also using the open platform package, with like Leif is going to present. I think you're going to present later in the week, right? The whole idea behind it. And but we did want to have like a firmware that is upstream, basically, and using the latest versions and so on, and following kind of the standards that we support in enterprise, which in this case would be ACPI only, basically. So which is firmware and a kernel requirement. And for enterprise, we don't actually use like pre-built images. What we wanted to do is like kind of use the same workflow as people are using with the enterprise, which is just like getting the minimal ISO or like the ISO or just like the TFTP, the PXE images to basically do network installers for both like Debian and CentOS in that case. And simply like focusing on changing and including as part of the reference platform, just like the main pieces, which in this case would be the firmware and the kernel, and just like reproduce the installer, replicate the installer, but not actually adding any other change, simply just incorporating the kernel. And also, of course, like the other major components that are important for enterprise, we wanted to demonstrate that we could easily run those on ARM, in this case, the 64, like OpenStack, Docker, the ODPI Hadoop, like for big data, OpenGDK. We wanted to have a better understanding, of course, like an easy set of instructions and documentation so people could get and easily deploy, for example, OpenStack in one of the platforms that we support in here, easily using all the standards and everything that is also going to upstream at the same time. And now for the consumer edition, we did want to see if we could get the kernel, at least like for high key, in a newer version, basically. Like 3.18 was like too old, and we did want to try to reduce the maintenance on older kernels. And it was great work as well. Like John Stahl is in the end in the back of the room, and he's working like tirelessly on this, and which is awesome. Like it's super nice to see like Not only with 4.1, but also in 4.4 now. There's a lot of movement to try to get, like to newer kernels and being closer to upstream. And we also want, of course, like bootstrap the other C target that we had, which was like for open embedded, because open embedded is also critical for anyone doing, like for Linaro and many other people that are using and buying those boards, like the High-Key and Dragon. So what we did in the end, and which was nice, like during the process, we did have like a sprint in Cambridge, focusing on enterprise. And we got a lot of people from enterprise group, and of course like 96 boards, business baselines, and QA, and the lab support was like super intense week, but we were able to basically create most of the critical pieces for the release. And what we were able to release in the end is like we were finally able to have like an open firmware implementation for, in this case, for D02, which was which was using the open platform package. It wasn't still merged as part of the main branch, but it was like super useful anyway, because we could understand what it would take to move from the other maintenance workflow, which was like simply forking and pushing all your hardware specific things in there and releasing that, but instead splitting that out and try to work with the open platform package, which Leif is going to present in more details later in the week. In this case, for D02, it was only supporting SATA. SATA is known to be a little bit problematic on D02, but it was still, the SAS support would take quite a lot of effort to get done by that time. So we decided to just simply release with SATA and later on include support for SAS. We had one single kernel for enterprise, which was in that time like for RC4 based, including ACPI support by default. So like for both like D02 and Overdrive, it was gonna boot like with ACPI without any additional arguments and would just work. We also were able to produce like network installers for both Debian and CentOS. The CentOS was still like kind of in the alpha state because we still required a few other changes and that we didn't have actually time to do. So we basically decided to push like the proper support for CentOS in the following release. And there was also a lot of work that happened on some of the major components, like for example, OpenStack, Docker, BigTop. We get most of the issues in there were actually, besides of course like having the packages available for ARM64, was actually going through the usual documentation that you have for other architectures, making sure that like everything works properly with ARM64, and showing and basically kind of giving the complete like walkthrough for anyone that wanted to reproduce that locally. And for High-Key, we were able to release the Heifers platform build on for IOSP using the 4.1 kernel, so which was like a pretty good turning point. Since then we kind of just basically stopped it like maintaining the 3.18, and started looking forward for newer versions. And the open embedded Yocto effort started, but was still like missing, of course, like the integrated kernel that could work with multiple and all the platforms that we had, including CE and EE. So there's still like working that we required for the further release for the 1603. And here, like what we learned on 1512. Basically, for enterprise, as we started like building the kind of the support in an easy way for anyone to consume, in this case like system installer, the firmware, the kernel, deploying OpenStack, and so on. Trying to produce, of course, this end-to-end use case, we noticed that documentation itself is just like too spread out. Like most of the times, you go to a wiki page, but it's not up to date. It's like on a platform that is not necessarily relevant. And then you go like to the OpenStack, for example, documentation, and like the stuff that they're referring there is not actually pointing to the latest version. So when you try that, like it fails and that kind of thing. So we did say that there was like a big need to improve the documentation in that case, and try to make like an easy for anyone that simply wanted to install with the network installer on a D02 Overdrive. It was kind of a nightmare. Nobody knew like what they need, like how to set up like TFTP server, like where should they put like the places in there, what kind of firmware, how to flash the firmware, how to boot the installer, that kind of thing, which is easy once you know it, but like it was so spread out and all over like the place, which was complicated for someone that was like just starting on this. What we also noticed as part of like kind of the same thing that happened with the consumer edition, like we had like many teams in Linaro like had maintaining their own kernel and firmware as well, which showed like kind of the problem. Like we did have like teams using D02s, for example, which is like we're using device tree and like in an older kernel, and then another team like maintaining their own like like kernel trees or firmware versions and so on, and that doesn't actually make a lot of sense inside Linaro. It should kind of all work together and try to reduce that. And it was great to see at least like the Juno effort that happened after that. I mean, like on 1603, by the 1603, the Juno is mostly moved to open platform package, right? Which is great. At that time, like the Lenny team had their own tree, and we had like a separate tree like for open platform package, which is not compatible, and so on and so forth. And now finally, of course, like life figured out with the ARM Lenny team, which is great. And one thing was interesting thing in there that we noticed, like during the release, during the sprint, is that the kernel itself is not, the upstream kernel is not able to, like transparently handle the device tree and ACPI support. If you boot the kernel with device tree, which, the firmware given a device tree, which happens also like in UEFI, in ACPI, it will basically boot with device tree by default. Like if you want to use ACPI on ARM64, you need kind of to enforce on a kernel command line, which is less than ideal if you want to have like installer or a generic, for example, kernel package that simply do the right thing depending on the platform. So I think that's something that we're going to be discussing later this week. I know that Emily wanted to bring that up with some of the maintainers in here, so we can try to see like what is the right implementation to get both device tree and ACPI working without extra requirements. The automation, of course, is critical since we're doing the installers. We wanted to get it going so we can, like every time that we need a new firmware or like a new kernel, we can easily deploy that and automate the whole process to make sure that we keep like testing through the release. And the OpenStack as well, like was for Debian in that case, but also for CentOS. It was like kind of an interesting thing. Like we noticed that each distribution in that case, like for OpenStack, we're maintaining their packages a little bit different than the others. So when you try like to produce like kind of a reference build for like for OpenStack, what should you do? So we try to like use the upstream like effort to try to have like generic packaging for both distributions, but that ended up like conflicting with, for example, the implementation, the packages from Debian and CentOS. So it's kind of a mess. What we decided to do in the end was like simply working with both like kind of distributions on their own way until we figure out if there's kind of possibly like a common way moving forward. And also like the kernel maintenance policy was something that we noticed that it was required in there. Like since we're like building the kernel, and we had the unified kernel tree, we were like getting patches from different people that were not necessarily, of course, like upstream yet, and but we didn't want to ensure that we, that we don't actually keep maintaining those patches unless there's an effort to get that upstream. Otherwise, we kind of it will become a distribution. So we're not kind of the end goal. We're just like kind of presenting, like the kind of the inflow and while it's going upstream. And we did create the policy, and Emmett is going to talk a little bit more about it, like showing the status and the kind of the patches that we have, which is quite a few with the new kernel. And we do want to make sure that for further releases and everything that we do, we keep track of every patch that is required and make sure that we kind of enforce the policy through the process as well, to make sure that they're going to the right places. So, and then like finally the last release, which was just out this weekend. What we wanted to do in there, like since we had like bootstrapped both the consumer and the enterprise edition at that time, we wanted to try basically to like bring both together and see if we could have like one single kernel that could work with both the Dragon board and high key, but also like all the enterprise targets and doing the right thing, like selecting device tree on the consumer editions and selecting and using ACPI on the enterprise. And for Debian in that case, we did want to start like improving a little bit of the hardware acceleration support, including the FreeGenerator driver, which wasn't included before. Also, like of course, like using the unified kernel for both high key and Dragon. And for AOSP, we kind of, there was kind of a work going on in parallel, like from the mobile team, and it's great work from the mobile team and Rob Herring as well, is trying to get the first AOSP kind of developer preview for Dragonboard using the free Arduino driver and Mesa instead of the binaries and the drivers that they use in their own Android implementation. And now for enterprise, of course, we wanted to update the kernel to use the final version at that time, which would be kind of the same one that we're going to be bringing support for High-Key and Dragon, but also adding support for some of the extra hardware that we had available internally, which was like the Mustang and the Moonshot, like for the HP M100 and 400. This was basically so we could start like reusing some of that hardware like internally and also like offer as a kind of a base platform for the developer cloud effort that was kind of just presented in the morning. Then for ADK2, what we want to try to do in there is like fix several of the issues that we had for D02, add support for SAS, which is the stable storage in D02, but also, of course, like including PCIe support. And we did want to have, like, for all the targets, since we're like focusing on a developer cloud, making sure that all the targets like had ACPI support, KVM was working and functioning properly, and also PCIe, because it was crucial, like, for not only the work that we do, but for other teams as well to start like being more engaged and use different. Start like building different use cases. In this case, for example, the network working group, they could simply start like using the open data plane, using some of the PCIe cards, the network cards that are supported already. So it would be enabling a new use case in there. We also wanted, since the CentOS support was not that great, we wanted to start like improving it and make sure that the release was properly supported for CentOS using the same kernel and the same components that we had before for Debian. And as I said, like making sure that all the requirements from developer cloud were properly covered through the release. So we could cover during here to connect all the other work that they're doing in there. So basically, what we ended up like doing, this release was tough because it was simply like 2 months. There wasn't a lot of like actually time, and after January, people are kind of slowly getting back after vacations, and then we had like the Chinese New Year, so it's kind of a little bit like tough in that sense. But we were able to deliver the final short kernel that we had like as a goal since the beginning, which George just presented in the morning. And this is great because then we could simply start like reusing the effort, like the validation effort, development effort, like the documentation and everything in one single point. This was critical for us in order to reduce the maintenance and also like start like allowing other people to start like consuming that. As I said, we were able to in the end like to have device free support for CE builds, which means like Husky and not Husky, sorry, the High-Key and a Dragonboard, ACPI for enterprise, and we were finally able to have like one single kernel package and config to be used by multiple boards, which it's amazing. Then for consumer edition, what we delivered, we continue improving the pre-built images for Debian and AOSP. On the Debian, we switched both flavors for Husky, for High-Key and Dragonboard to use the unified kernel. We also, like, with help with Nicholas, started like updating some of the packages in there for better graphics support in a Dragonboard. So allowing us to support like for Arduino out of the box. And we also were able to deliver the first developer preview for Dragonboard. Rob Herring was able to get in the end Mesa working properly on AOSP, and of course like with help of like Rob Clark and the mobile team as well. And we finally were able to get on not only on ARM, but to basically a generic image based on AOSP, which uses Mesa. And since like for Arduino uses Mesa, we could start like exercising that and adding support for Dragonboard. And for High-Key, we did, I think it was basically finished, the 4.1, specific work that we had, which was kind of use it as a base for the announcement as presented today, which is now kind of the century that is published on ASP. And the Dragon board is using a more recent one, since it shares quite a lot with the Debian images. It uses Mesa, using the Freedrino. It simply makes sense to use the same kernel. Now for enterprise, we were able to add more hardware support. In this case, where the Mustang and the Overdrive H0, which we do have quite a few boxes, but they had like problems because, of course, like it's an early revision of the hardware. And also the Moonshot. I mean, in case like the A0, you still need like a PCIe card for network, since we're not carrying over those patches that would enable the built-in network interface, because they're now actually never going upstream because it was an early revision of the hardware. We were able to update installers like the Jessie with 8.3, which was released on February, if I recall correctly, and also the CentOS, which there was a new spin by Jim, I think like on January. So we started like to use the new version that was out at that time. We got in the end like ACPI, KVM, PCIe supported by all the enterprise platforms. So we could like start exercising and deploying cloud, and like the demo that you saw in the morning is basically using all of this technology that we're able to deliver. And for the components, we just basically continue doing and deploying and validating what we had before, such as OpenStack and Docker. And in this case was better because since we had KVM fully supported now, we could do proper, cloud deployment instead of just rely on a QEMU without acceleration. And so what we learned through this process is basically there were like several platform issues when trying to consolidate a kernel, which is going like from the config changes, like you enable like one single config, for example, it would end up like breaking another board. So we had to spend like quite a few days just figuring out like what are kind of the configuration set that it would simply work with all the boards without breaking anything. And we also like were able to understand like quite a lot of the drivers, they were actually only tested as built-in. They were never actually built as modules before. So like you build as modules, simply doesn't work or like explodes or something along the line. And so you had like to bring in a lot of drivers to be part of the kernel as built-in, which is less than ideal, but at least we kind of know the problem now and start like figuring that and understanding the solutions, and also work with the upstream to get that fixed. Emmett is going to cover in a different presentation, like I think it was on Friday, if I recall correctly, showing kind of the work and all the effort that was done to get this unified kernel in place for this release. And since we got the release functioning and properly with the features that we expected, we started to notice that the performance was not necessarily ideal. We wanted to start like making sure that not only the features are in place now, since they are, but also continue, of course, like maintaining that, but making sure that we have proper stress testing that covers the complete like use cases scenarios, such as deploying cloud, making sure that it's stress the cloud, the open big data and everything, to make sure that it's not only stable, but start like identifying what we need to improve to make sure that ARM64 and the server is a proper platform to be consumed by anyone that wants to buy it. And also something that we're starting to discuss now is the release cadence, like for every quarter, basically every 3 months, might be too aggressive depending on the segment group and the team working with us. So that's something that we notice. Of course, like specifically on enterprise, is you don't actually move that fast. You want to make sure that in this case you're not only developing but validating the whole thing, and it takes a while, but also want to have time to fix the bugs that we find. So we are working to see what can be done in there. And we also expect more participation from different segment groups. In this case, like we saw the need, like the network working group and some other segment groups, who were kind of not only duplicating a little some of the work that we had, but also they wanted to start like reusing what we were able to deliver, specifically like for enterprise. The single kernel that works with PCIe on D02 and Overdrive and all the other platforms that we have is just great. It's great as a start point for their own development. So we wanted more participation from different segment groups as well. So kind of in general, what we noticed in Linaro, like through these releases, is there was indeed like this need to help filling the gap between the upstream and the distros. We're never going to be a distribution. We don't want to be that, a distribution. So we need to make sure that we, of course, like we're always kind of doing the right thing, working together with the upstream, avoiding like people to create their own solution and maintaining their own solution internally, but making sure, of course, like that whatever work that we do either goes upstream or like goes to the distros properly, and so avoid like and reduce the maintenance. And upstreaming, of course, upstreaming is the key here. Everything that we do, we need to have like a strong policy. We don't want to be the end goal for anyone, simply because then we're going to become a product. We actually want to build a reference platform for people to build and improve and use on different products. But through that process, the upstreaming is key, because then they could like possibly later on simply reuse the applications done by some of the upstream, for example, upstream distributions like Debian or like CentOS, Ubuntu, and so on. Well, if you do the work right, they will simply just work on the further releases. And we also like saw that it's quite a good effort to start like building this in order to reduce the application in the organization itself. I was happy to see that like the big engagement from different working groups and different segment groups to like work on a kind of a single and all shared and focus on one single goal, which is like as Linaro itself, like making sure that we talk, that we work together with each other, that we reduce the application, that we all work together, like pushing things upstream, and so everybody can be successful in the end of the day. So what we're planning now, since the release was just completed, basically one, of course, like we do have, we gather like a lot of data through these releases, like the things that are not upstream, the things that are missing, the bugs, issues, like, or features that needs to be developed for like some of the platforms to be properly supported. So the work will continue, of course, like to work with everyone like maintaining that, to make sure that like keep pushing upstream. We're going to be helping as well, like through the bug fixing process, like triaging the bugs, make sure that we QA and test them through the releases, but also make sure, like either the members that are responsible for that hardware, for example, that are indeed like working on fixing those bugs and working with upstream and so on, so we can like reduce the maintenance and improve the project over time. We will possibly, of course, like extend to more boards, including, of course, like any 9.6 board that might come up, that might show up, like the new, for example, the Husky, when it's finally out, and any other board, of course, that we get over the time. But also extend the integration with hardware from different members. And also, of course, like as part of the project, we also want to make sure that it's easy for anyone to know how it is to enable a new platform. For example, support the reference platform on a new platform. What is the work that would be required? And since we were able to do like a pretty good like cross-team effort in Linaro, and everyone is kind of like working on their own reference implementation. Like we had the home group, for example, they're producing their own reference implementation using Wayland and Open Embedded and ClearKey and so on. We want to make sure, of course, like everyone that is working on such implementations, that we can all like work together and sit together, like and check what are the requirements and see if we can simply connect like those dots and make sure that we are all like optimizing the process and the development as well. And what we're going to be doing this week is, of course, creating the new specification revision, which would include work for additional segment groups. So we're going to be talking this week with the mobile group, with the home group, with network working group, to make sure that all their needs as well is covered by the project, and have a kind of an understanding what they're required, and so we can like start including them as part of the milestones moving forward. And I think that's Yang that did that one. I just like took and put it in here. But this kind of shows the workflow that we think and how we're going to be maintaining the project as we move forward in Linaro. The whole idea and why this is kind of connected and why this is connected with the 96 boards team and the hardware specification as well. So basically the work that we're going to do is like work across all the teams and all the development that they're doing and make sure that we evolve the reference platform, incorporating those components. Like sometimes, of course, like we just need to either like release into QA as part of the process or simply document or simply point to the right places which if they're, for example, already maintaining their own project separately, for example, in this case, like Open Data Plane. And, but we also want to make sure that depending on the needs of the project, we also keep evolving the hardware platform specification to cover that. So let's suppose the network working group has like their own needs. It would be great if they could also have their own platform, their own hardware platform, which would be part of the next 6 boards. So we can, you know, like not only them can use and reuse that internally, it would be also make it easier for anyone that wants to, you know, like to help developing the same solution that they're working on. And not only, for example, network, like the Internet of Things and the TV, like any kind of the work that we do, we kind of want to work, as George was saying earlier in the day, make sure that we collaborate in all the senses for all the teams, like working all together, the kind of the same goals, see if we can share the platform, if not, if we can develop a new platform as part of the 96 board hardware specification. And so we can basically optimize the development process inside Linaro. And basically, kind of as I said, the goal for the Connect, for this Connect, what we're going to be doing is talking with each of the core segment groups, so we can have like a better understanding of what their needs, and so we can start like basically deciding and designing the next milestones. And of course, like understanding if like each segment group will have their own schedule, kind of what are the new requirements that they have, new platforms that might be coming out. And we do hope like by the end of the week we have like a clear understanding in the plan, and of course like publish after Connect, so we can basically get the next milestone ongoing already, which is the 1606. And I think that's pretty much it. We'll let like some minutes for questions. So if someone can help me with the microphone.
Just some observations, kind of, you know, around the release cadence that you were talking about. Maybe it didn't work so well for enterprise. Have you thought about feature-based releases? And I'm just offering this up because I feel like there was some compromises made because you had to get the release out. And as you add more hardware, because, you know, community hardware, member hardware, 96 board hardware, it's going to be harder to hit that quarter goal. So maybe a feature-based release would be better. That way we can kind of ensure we get the features right for all the hardware, and then we make a release. What are your thoughts on that?
So our thinking at the moment is we need to define a set of core and base components that we keep like on a strong and defined cadence. Like, let's suppose like the kernel is one example. And then of course like work with the other segment groups to see, depending, as you said, depending on the feature that, you know, like that needs to be delivered at a specific time. To see if we can start like modifying the milestones in a way that it would work better for them, would stress less the other people, and of course like work to, you know, like better in the organization as well. But this is something that we're still going to figure out like as we talk with the teams this week, because we also, you know, like the problem is when you try to work like with the unified kernel as an example, how can you know, like develop a new feature not necessarily affecting the others that are relying on a different cadence? You know, like something that we're still kind of trying to figure out this week as we talk with the segment groups.
I think one of the concerns you kind of touched on there was, you know, the basic core functionality, right?
Yeah.
And you mentioned kernel, but it would be nice also to like Wi-Fi, right? From release to release, Wi-Fi should work on both on all the boards, right? So just making sure we have a plan in place for those basic functionalities to happen each release and make sure they work, I think would be ideal. But, you know, as you get more hardware, this is going to be really difficult for you guys to do and for all of us to do really in that 3 months. Make sure it's stable.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
Oh, just a question on like,
Who is speaking?
you mentioned the 4.4 kernel. Is that the 4.4 LSK, or is that the 4.4 upstream kernel? What is the philosophy on?
It's an interesting, yeah, of course, like observation. What we did was like simply using the final kernel because like at that time we didn't have like LSK. We're simply like working through the RCs and get it out. Like we basically started like reusing it once that was released. But we're not like in this stable development, you know, like kind of game in here. I know that it's a little bit tricky. It's something that we're going to be like working in more with the teams and understanding their needs. Since like 4.4 is an LSK, everybody want to keep using that over the time. But as a reference platform, we don't want to like keep maintaining too much, you know, like spending too much effort on older kernels. We actually want to move it forward. So something that we still need to find out, like the balance and see if what are the needs inside the company. I know that there's a team dedicated to work with the LSK, but they're not accepting necessarily hardware, you know, like a hardware development in there and enablement. And we're going to be doing that as part of the reference platform. So the idea that we had initially was simply that we're going to be publishing as we do the releases, all the topic branches and everything that is required for you to support a new platform if you want. But it's kind of up to you, or like if you want to bring that up to the team maintaining, you know, like your team case maintaining the kernel, or somebody else who wants to maintain the product using the LSK, but consuming the patches that enables the additional hardware that is part of our release.
so when people are talking about the reference platform, we're saying two things. We're saying this is an example of what you should be doing when you're shipping software for an ARM-based product. And we're also very clearly saying this is not a distribution.
Yep.
Now, there's obviously an inherent tension there because, especially for the consumer and enterprise spaces, what we should be shipping is a distribution. So what's the thinking there? I mean, are you going to start doing things like offering upgrade paths for users? Or, cause, I mean, and also this is like it's not just a reference platform, it's also the firmware we should use on 96 boards. So, I mean, what's the plan there? How do you plan to resolve that tension?
Sorry, can you summarize the question? Yeah.
So the question is, you're saying the reference platform build is not a distribution, right?
Yeah.
But we're also saying this is what you should do. And clearly what you should do in at least some of the spaces you're operating in is ship a distribution. You shouldn't be shipping a distribution with some random stuff tacked on top of it and throw it over the wall and run away very fast. So I mean, is there a plan to resolve this tension?
Well, when we say like that we're not a distribution, it's simply because if you become one, you kind of end up like being the end goal, and you start like competing with the other people. So in Linaro, that doesn't necessarily make sense, right? As the organization, the work that we do. So we want to enforce, which is why like, the policy for everything that we do and produce the images and so on is critical. Because what we do want to do is like as we develop a new feature and support a new feature and focusing on upstreaming and getting that supported, then you're going to reduce the amount of work that we required. And then like some other distros could just like end up like doing the work as I said, if they wanted. Simply, you know, because we already have like both like
right,
kind of
sure,
efforts.
Upstreaming is wonderful, and you'll never find me arguing against it. But that's not really the question or the issue. Right, but this is also the firmware for 96 boards. And it's also an example of what you should do if you have extra stuff that you need. So, I mean, ideally, the reference platform build should go away. But in the meantime...
Well, that is not necessarily going away if you also, like, if you're thinking of new features that you want to deploy, new hardwares and so on.
Right. But this is the thing, though. If in the meantime, you're shipping this stuff, but you're not a distribution.
Right, but
But
which
you're
is why, like,
you look like a distribution, and you.
what Emmett said, for example, like, which is why, like, we're saying, like, we need to work, for example, with Debian backports. What that means, like, if you have a packaging change, we push in Debian, and then, of course, we get in backports. Naturally, this is upstream in the distro in that case. For the other pieces, if you're maintaining something, of course, like, it's simple. But if you are, like, sharing a different project, like kernel, firmware, and so on, we simply work with the upstream. We're trying to reduce, like, if there's upstreaming work required both on the distributions, we're going to do that as well.
This still doesn't really. This still doesn't answer the question about the reference platform build's role as an example of how you should ship a system.
Right.
That and part of how you should ship a system for not for every space. Some spaces you don't need this, like the IoT space. It's probably not so relevant, for example. But for a lot of spaces, you should ship a distribution. You should, so you get the ongoing support.
Well, that depends on the product, right, really, in the end of the day.
Yeah, but for like enterprise, clearly, you know.
But which is what we're doing, like, for example, for enterprise, which the whole idea was simply just have an installer. Like, you have the distribution. But we cannot, like, have our kernel necessarily, like, upstream in a distribution. So we just have the kernel and the installer. And then, it's just basically plain Debian, for example. And if you have, like, a change in OpenStack and Hadoop or whatever, we can, like, work through that backports and get it stuff, like, included upstream. And then, even if you don't want to use our kernel or so on and it gets the upstream kernel, you're going to, like, benefit of all the work that is done.
Right, but you're shipping a derivative distribution, which is great. I mean, that's a.
Yeah? Where's the other mic? Yeah.
Sorry, just you're asking.
Yeah, I think we're kind of over the clock in here.
Yeah, I think it's not even a derivative. It's not even a blend or a respin, whatever distro you are coming from or people are using. It's modified packages, and there's also some extra stuff that doesn't exist anywhere else. So yeah, I think we should say it's a distro.
Yeah, it's a minimal and hopefully very upstream distro, but there's still an aspect there.
What we're saying is not a distro, of course, like if they're producing builds, like we're mostly saying like we're not in the distro business, right? That would mean like support, security updates, and all that work that we're not like interested. So, but we also want to enable people, like to use the current distributions, but use the latest development that we have. So how do you end up like doing that in the end? If you just simply focus, like on the component and don't, like stop like caring about like the user can flash whatever, how, like that's not going to work. We need to show like something in a solution.
I think this is one of the things you solve by upstreaming so much. You actually don't need to do very much of this support because...
Right, but it takes a while. That's the thing. So the things that we saw, like, it takes a while to upstream things, right? What are you going to do until you upstream, until you are fully upstream? Inside the organization, we're using the same component. We're using the same hardware.
I'm not disagreeing, I'm just...
Like, it's complicated. It's tricky. It's always kind of a balance that we have, like, between upstream and between distros.
Yeah.